Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I'm the Director of Research of the Research Institute at CCSRE and Professor in the Graduate School of Education. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you, especially our guest, Professor Kat Ramírez from University of California, Santa Cruz. We're going to be learning today in this faculty seminar series about her recent work, Assimilations and Alternative History. I would like to start first with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Stanford occupies the lands of the Muwekma Ohlone Nation, the indigenous inhabitants of the San Francisco Bay Area. That this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona band. We recognize that these people were dispossessed by colonization and white supremacy, and that these processes are not events, but ongoing social forces, and that indigenous people stand in solidarity with our African-American brothers and sisters during this time of struggle and national reckoning. We're excited to continue this series on faculty seminars to learn about our colleagues' work. Today is going to be exciting to learn about this work on assimilation. This work has been led by many people on campus, some of whom are here in the room. There is a 25-year legacy of excellent work in the center, and we are excited to continue advancing that. We want to make sure that our efforts expand disciplinary representation in the center and the academic activities we lead, as well as promote and increase faculty and student engagement in all of our activities. So I want to make sure that you know about upcoming events. On November 4th, we're going to have another research seminar, Chautauqua, with Ado Quaison from the English department, celebrating his new book, Tragedy and Post-Colonial Literature. So make sure that you mark that on your calendar. It's going to be an exciting discussion, November 4th. On November 5th, we'll have, as part of our Imagining Justice project, featuring Elizabeth Reese from Stanford Law and Abby Abinanti, Chief Judge of the Yurok Tribe, discussing American Indian tribal laws of criminal responsibility. And this will be a virtual event, November 5th. We hope to see you here. And if you go to our website, you can find more information about a number of other events that we're excited to be hosting. So please spend some time looking at this. Today's event is going to be hybrid, so we'll have audience online, and our executive director, Daniel Murray, will be fielding questions. So please use the chat feature for questions as we move along. Today, then, we'll do the following. Our colleague, Tomás Jiménez, will serve as chair and discussant of the event. And he will introduce our speaker, Professor Catherine Ramírez. Then Professor Ramírez will present, and Tomás will return to kick off our discussion and moderate a question and answer segment. And we welcome questions from all of you as well. Let me say a word about our colleague Jiménez, Tomás Jiménez. He is professor of sociology at Stanford. He's the author of a number of books on immigration and assimilation, including most recently, States of Belonging, Immigration Policies, Attitudes, and Inclusion, as well as The Other Side of Assimilation, How Immigrants Are Changing American Life. He's the former director of academic programs at CCSRE, as well as the former director of Chicano Latina Studies. Welcome, Tomás. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It's so nice to be back with you in person. And it is a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Catherine Ramírez. Catherine Ramírez is the chair of Latin American and Latino Studies at UC Santa Cruz. She's a scholar of Mexican American history, race, migration, and citizenship, Latinx literature and visual culture, comparative ethnic studies, gender studies, and speculative fiction. In addition to the book that she's going to talk about today, Assimilation and Alternative History, she's also author of The Women in the Zoot Suit, Gender Nationalism and the Cultural Politics of Memory. And she's co-editor of Precarity and Belonging, Labor, Migration, and Non-Citizenship. She's also written for public audiences beyond the academy, including for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Public Books, and Boom, California. Professor Ramírez has multiple awards and honors, including a fellowship from the Ford Foundation, She was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford just a couple of years ago. And I think that's where you spent quite a bit of time working on this book. She was the UC Santa Cruz's inaugural Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant winner and John E. Sawyer Seminar on Comparative Studies and Cultures. And she won UC Santa Cruz's Excellence in Teaching Award. I can say that I'm extremely excited to have read the book and excited to hear from Kat, because we talked quite a bit about this book before it was published and when she was working on it. And it's a real honor to have you back at Stanford, and I want to welcome you to the podium.
So thank you for the warm welcome. I am especially grateful to Professor Paula Moya and the Center for Comparative Studies and Race and Ethnicity for inviting me here. It's especially meaningful to be back at Stanford since, as Professor Jiménez just noted, I finished writing this book, Assimilation, as a Caspis Fellow in 2020. And is it possible for me to share my screen? Yeah, that's it. And go to present. Thank you. All righty, here we go. So this book took shape after I wrote my first book, The Woman in the Zoot Suit. However, the seed for assimilation was planted years ago when I read Samuel Huntington's The Hispanic Challenge. And in this incendiary article from 2004, and then in his subsequent book, Who Are We?, Huntington warned that immigration from Latin America threatened the cultural and political integrity of the US. Hispanics, he claimed, were unable and unwilling to assimilate into an inherently Anglo-Protestant US mainstream. As I finished writing The Woman in the Zoot Suit, I couldn't help but wonder how much Huntington sounded like the World War II era cops, teachers, judges, social workers, reporters, and scholars who had insisted that second-generation Mexican-American youth were so unassimilable that they were unfit for the responsibilities of democracy. According to their contemporary critics, Mexican-American Zooters didn't embody an alternative form of Americanness. Instead, they were essentially and defiantly un-American, so much so that their conspicuous markers of difference, their zoot suits, their ducktails, and their falcos had to be forcibly removed during the Zoot Suit riots. And we see a photo of that here. I'm gonna take a, it's hard to talk through a mask. I'm not teaching this quarter because I'm department chair. And so I'm like, whoa, this is what it's like. So Huntington's anxiety prodded me to contemplate assimilation and its outsized role in defining who is and who isn't American. What is assimilation, I wondered? What is the history of this concept in the US? How has assimilation been defined and measured? When and why does it come to matter? And what is at stake in debates about assimilation and assimilability? So these questions guided me as I immersed myself in scholarship on assimilation, and much of the work I read was by sociologists and historians. Different disciplinary differences notwithstanding, I was struck by the link that scholars had forged between assimilation and immigration. At the same time, I was tasked by my department with teaching a course titled Immigration and Assimilation, and the conjoining of these two terms inspired a new set of questions. Is assimilation always expected to be an outcome of immigration? Is assimilation the domain of immigrants exclusively? Or can people who aren't immigrants assimilate or be assimilated? And these questions led me to the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C., where I began poring over the records of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the first federally funded coeducational off-reservation boarding school for Native Americans. And I set my sights on Carlisle because its goal was to assimilate, and in the words of its founder, Richard Henry Pratt, to citizenize Native Americans. And citizenize was one of Pratt's neologisms. So Carlisle was founded in 1879 on the cusp of what's known in Native American history as the allotment and assimilation era. And this is the period from the 1880s until World War II, more or less. During the allotment and assimilation era, the US government sought to assimilate Native Americans by breaking up tribal lands and removing indigenous people, particularly indigenous children, from their homes and communities. Assimilation was used synonymously with civilization. Self-professed friends of the Indian, like Pratt, maintained that Native Americans needed to be uprooted and brought into contact with whites in order to be assimilated. In the 19th century, the enslavement of Africans and their New World descendants was upheld as a model for assimilating Native Americans. For example, Pratt saw slavery as, quote, the greatest blessing that ever came to the Negro race, unquote. He described the process of civilizing so-called backward races as assimilation under duress. The idea that assimilation is something that must be imposed, endured, and earned has a long history in this country. We see it in efforts to civilize African Americans and Native Americans, in the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, and most recently in the management of undocumented immigrants. And these are points I'll return to momentarily. Curiously, the quest to civilize African Americans and Native Americans isn't part of the discourse on assimilation as it's come to be understood in the US.
Want to try this?
Is that one going to be better?
I think so.
Have a filter. Like, I'm so paranoid. I have a filter.
I think I would try that. It's going to be looser. And, this yours is cuter.
After
but,
Delta though, I switched to mask with filters.
Yes.
And that's because in general, I don't spend a lot of time indoors with many people. This is a first for me. Thank you. It is much better. All righty. Okay. So as I was saying, curiously, and you can hear me better too. Perfect. Yes, thank you.
That looks good.
Thank you. The quest to civilize African Americans and Native Americans isn't part of the discourse on assimilation as it's come to be understood in the US, nor are African American narratives of racial passing part of that discourse. The allotment and assimilation era and African American passing narratives are part of what I call assimilation's prehistory. And by prehistory, I refer to the period before assimilation came to be associated with immigration. And to bring that period into relief, my book begins by decoupling immigration and assimilation. So I have divided my book into two main parts. The first half focuses on assimilation's prehistory. Its scope goes from the allotment and assimilation era to the Cold War. The second half problematizes the connection between immigration and assimilation. The period it covers, goes from the Cold War up to the Trump presidency. And bridging my book's two sections are a discussion of Black and undocumented denizenship, and an analysis of the figures of the Cold War era model minority and the 21st century dreamer. So I'll talk about denizenship momentarily. The dreamer, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, is the would-be beneficiary of the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. So in chapter 1, I present various definitions of assimilation, from the general or the vernacular to the academic to my own. And generally speaking, assimilation refers to a process of absorbing or becoming more alike. Scholars have defined it as a boundary crossing, for example, from margin to mainstream or from minority to majority. Building on these earlier definitions of assimilation and on assimilation's prehistory, I define assimilation as a relational process whereby the boundary between unequal groups and between inside and outside blurs, disappears, or paradoxically is reinforced. Assimilation is a process whereby some people are transformed into insiders while others are rendered outsiders on the inside. It's both a process of homogenization and differential inclusion. And I call this the paradox of assimilation. I introduced the paradox of assimilation in chapter 1. And to do so, I began with the discussion of assimilation's etymology. So before assimilation was understood as a socio-cultural process, the word referred to a process of absorption, for example, of ideas or nutrients. In this late 19th, early 20th century ad for an elixir that was said to cure myriad maladies, assimilation means digestion here in this ad. Assimilation took on new politically charged meaning as people moved through space and came into contact with each other. As the US expanded across and beyond North America, as the government and its agents broke up tribal lands and removed Native Americans from their homes and communities, as African Americans migrated from the rural South to the urban North, and as immigrants arrived at the nation's ports of entry. By the start of the 20th century, assimilation referred not only to a biological or physiological process, but to a social and cultural one as well. And connecting assimilation's old and new meanings, sociologist Robert Park wrote in 1914 in his first publication about assimilation, by a process of nutrition somewhat similar to the physiological one, we may conceive alien peoples to be incorporated with and made part of the community or state. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, assimilation's meaning exploded. No longer referring simply to absorption or digestion, assimilation came to signify civilization and then Americanization, Anglo-conformity, acculturation, incorporation, and integration. European immigrants of the Great Wave, the influx of some 20 million people to the US between 1880 and 1924, and their white American progeny became the protagonists in the master narrative of assimilation. By the end of the 20th century, the assimilability of Asians would sometimes be lauded, while that of Mexicans and Muslims would be called into question. Meanwhile, Native Americans and African Americans disappeared from the discourse on assimilation. One of my book's objectives is to highlight the key roles that non-immigrants and the putatively unassimilable have played in our understandings of assimilation. And by non-immigrants, I refer not only to indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and their US-born descendants, but also to people who aren't recognized as real or legitimate immigrants. Chapter 2 looks at efforts to civilize Native Americans, African Americans, and Puerto Ricans in the wake of the Indian, Civil, and Spanish-American Wars. And these were moments when regimes of difference in the US and its colonies were being challenged and consolidated. This chapter pays particular attention to the Puerto Ricans who attended Carlisle from 1898 until the school's closure in 1918. I learned about Carlisle's Puerto Rican students when I began my research at the National Archives. And at the time, I had no idea that I would come across evidence that around 60 Puerto Ricans, as well as some Mexicans and at least one Filipino, attended the infamous boarding school for Native Americans. Who were these Puerto Ricans, I wondered, and how and why did they end up at Carlisle? In addition to learning English and a trade, what did they learn about their place in an expanding empire, a nation of burgeoning immigration, and a hardening racial hierarchy defined increasingly by the so-called vanishing Indian and the one-drop rule for African Americans? How did Carlisle's white, Black, and brown Puerto Rican students who weren't immigrants but colonial subjects fit into or frustrate that hierarchy? By and large, American scholars have defined assimilation against racialization, the process whereby racial categories are produced and understood as part of a social hierarchy. The case of Carlisle's Puerto Rican students prompted me to approach assimilation not as the opposite of racialization, but as an illustration of it. In addition to underscoring the connections between African American and Native American education and the ways African American students were upheld as models for their Native American classmates, Chapter 2 shows how Carlisle's Puerto Rican students were incorporated into a stratified society as racialized and colonized subjects. It also analyzes how they resisted that incorporation. By juxtaposing efforts to civilize Native Americans, African Americans, and Puerto Ricans, I draw attention to assimilation as a mutually constitutive process of categorization. Put another way, assimilation is relational, which is something sociologists have been stressing for a long time. Like chapter 2, chapter 3, oops, what happened to, there we go, looks at a group of people that's usually not included in conversations about assimilation in the 21st century. In addition to exploring the vital and widely overlooked role African Americans have played in our understandings of assimilation, this chapter argues that African Americans have been overlooked in the discourse on assimilation because of the long-standing discrepancy between Blackness and Americanness. In other words, because of the legacy of Black denizenship in the US. A denizen, in the word's most general sense, is simply an inhabitant. In political theory and migration studies, denizens dwell in the territory of the nation state without formal citizenship status. Often they're barred from becoming citizens or their citizenship has been revoked. In the US, free and enslaved Blacks were denizens prior to the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. Today, participants in deferred action for childhood arrivals are denizens. Established by Barack Obama in 2012, DACA, as I'm sure many of you know, is an executive action that grants certain undocumented immigrants a temporary reprieve from deportation and temporary permission to work. I close chapter 3 by highlighting the parallels between African American denizenship and the denizenship of the documented. So chapter 3 is my favorite chapter because of its eclectic array of primary sources. It brings together the words of Thomas Jefferson and Donald Trump. It also puts Booker T. Washington and Robert Park's widely overlooked 1912 travelogue, The Man Farthest Down, in dialogue with George Schuyler's 1931 Afrofuturist tale of racial passing, Black No More. Has anyone here read Black No More? It is worth the read. It really is. So in addition to writing about women Zoot Suiters and assimilation, I'm a scholar and fan of science fiction. In chapter 3, I was able to combine my often competing research interests by highlighting the connections between assimilation and the future. Since chapter 3 is my favorite, I will read parts of it here. So I'll tell you a bit about Black No More. Set in the near future, Schuyler's novel is about a machine that turns Black people white. After the novel's protagonist, Max Disher, goes from Black to white, he changes his name to Matthew Fisher. He moves out of the ghetto, he marries a white woman, he achieves professional success, and he strikes it rich. In other words, he assimilates in precisely the ways assimilation tends to be measured and celebrated in this country. Where Black No More offers a vision in which the so-called Negro problem is solved by getting rid of Negroes, The Man Farthest Down is an argument against a post-Black future. Park and Washington's co-authored book chronicles a trip that the two men took to Europe together in 1910. At that time, Park worked as Washington's publicist and ghostwriter at the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, the school Washington founded for African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1881. This was before Park moved to the University of Chicago in 1914 and became known as an expert on race, immigration, and assimilation. Over 8 weeks, Park and Washington traveled from England to Russia. Washington wrote that he wanted to see the countries, quote, from which the majority of our immigrants are now coming to America, unquote. And it should come as no surprise that he took a keen interest in the so-called new immigrants of his time, Southern, Central, and European immigrants. As scholars in African American and critical whiteness studies have demonstrated, one of the first lessons these not quite white immigrants learned when they arrived in the US was pressing African Americans to the lowest level of the racial hierarchy, what Toni Morrison described as the most enduring and efficient rite of passage into American culture. With the man farthest down, Washington set out to refute the contention that the new immigrant could, quote, substitute for the Negro laborer, and in this direction, a solution for the race problem would be found, unquote. By comparing African Americans to Europeans, he sought to show that the former group was closer and therefore more similar to white Americans, particularly white Southerners, than the latter group was. Whatever else one may say of the Negro, Washington insisted, he is in everything except his color, more like the Southern white man, more willing and able to absorb the ideas and the culture of the white man and adapt himself to existing conditions than is true of any race which is now coming into this country. You can see that Park got a lot of his ideas from Washington, if you read Washington's writing. In fact, the European immigrants of Washington's time didn't replace African Americans. However, African Americans weren't folded into the American polity in quite the same way as the new immigrants and their white descendants. As Park pointed out in 1930, despite having been in the US for 300 years, African Americans hadn't been assimilated. They were in and of the US, but they weren't considered true Americans. Instead, they were denizens, people who are present in the space of the nation state, but who aren't and are never supposed to be full members of the polity. Neither outsiders nor insiders. By 1860, they were, to quote Park again, less assimilated than domesticated. Despite claims that assimilation results in homogeneity and racialization conserves difference, his observations indicate that certain social groups are incorporated, domesticated, to use his word, into a stratified society precisely as racialized subjects. Incorporation via marginalization or subordination. This is the paradox of assimilation. The discrepancy between African Americanness and Americanness persists in the 21st century. Take, for example, the conspiracy theories that Obama and Kamala Harris weren't born in this country and are therefore ineligible to be president or vice president. As long as African Americans are disassociated from Americanness, stories about racial passing, like Schuyler's Black No More, won't be considered stories about assimilation. Instead, they'll be read as tales about people who claim something that isn't supposed to be theirs, the power and privilege of US citizenship. In our time, stories about passing continue to circulate. Where the progressive era protagonist was African American, the hero of the 21st century passing narrative tends to be a young, undocumented immigrant. Like Park's domesticated Negroes, these new protagonists are in and of the US, but because they're not US citizens, they're not real Americans from the state's point of view. For example, DACA participants may be less illegal than undocumented immigrants who don't have DACA. Still, as non-citizens, the documented aren't authorized or documented enough or in quite the right way as far as the state is concerned. In fact, because DACA doesn't lead to any form of permanent regularization, it formalizes its participants' marginalization, thereby rendering them denizens. Nonetheless, these 21st century denizens have a deep connection to their adopted homeland. Many grew up and attended or still attend school here. Many are fluent in English. Many are familiar not only with US popular culture, but with this country's institution, history, narratives, and proclaimed values and ideals, especially as related to opportunity, hard work, merit, and education. So fluent and familiar are 21st century denizens that they often pass as Americans. Indeed, some don't realize that they're not US citizens until they reach a milestone of adolescence, like applying for a driver's license or applying to college. By unhinging Americanness from formal belonging, these self-proclaimed undocumented Americans challenge the state's monopoly on citizenship and offer a broader and more inclusive vision of the US. Now, despite their insistence that they truly are Americans, asterisks, albeit without papers, the undocumented live in a state of permanent temporariness. They remain vulnerable to deportation, a mechanism that renders certain individuals and groups temporary and unworthy of a nation's future. That many of the undocumented, the deportable, and the deported are Indigenous Central Americans, Black, and other people of color warrant scrutiny, especially in relation to the imperative to make America great again, a sinister campaign to maintain the white majority numerically or otherwise by driving people of color to the margins or out. MAGA evoked an earlier maxim: demography is destiny, as it attempted to reshape the future. Yet the peoples who were never envisioned as a real, legitimate, or permanent part of this settler colony come nation of immigrants have persevered. In the wake of the 2016 presidential election, old slogans like the post-Holocaust cry, never again, have taken on new meaning as migrant detention facilities have been likened to the Nazi and US concentration camps of the Second World War. All the while, new calls like here to stay, home is here, and there are Black people in the future defiantly envision an alternative future. Oh, feels good to take the mask off, but this is so much better. Thank you, Paula. So chapter 3 links the first and second halves of my book by showing how African Americans and undocumented immigrants share denizenship in common. Similarly, chapter 4 bridges the first and second halves of my book by tracing what I call a genealogy of deservingness from the Cold War era Japanese American model minority to the 21st century dreamer. Against the backdrop of the Black and Brown culture of poverty and the Moynihan Report, William Peterson, a sociologist at Berkeley, invented the figure of the model minority in 1966. In Success Story, Japanese American Style, he extolled Japanese Americans for overcoming, quote, the worst injustices, including color prejudice and the denial of their elementary rights, most notoriously in their evacuation to internment camps, unquote. As historian May Nye has shown, the US War Relocation Authority saw those camps as Americanizing projects that would speed the assimilation of Japanese Americans through democratic self-government, schooling, work, and other rehabilitative activities. Just as Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle School, maintained that Native Americans had to undergo assimilation under duress to earn US citizenship, War Relocation Authority officials considered internment a form of benevolent and coercive assimilation. Similarly, I argue in chapter 4 that the dreamers' exclusion and marginalization function as a proving ground of Americanness. Supporters of the DREAM Act have argued that because dreamers participate in society, they deserve a place in it. By juxtaposing the model minority and the dreamer, chapter 4 shows how both figures bolster the image of the US as an egalitarian meritocracy and a benevolent nation of immigrants. Furthermore, both figures serve a disciplinary function. Via close readings of John Okada's 1957 novel, No No Boy, and Alberto Ledesma's 2017 graphic memoir, Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer, I argue that the model minority and dreamer haven't achieved full or formal citizenship. Rather, they have only contingent, partial, and attenuated inclusion. I continue my discussion of the relationship between assimilation and deservingness in chapter 5. This chapter examines what I call the taxonomy of mobile subjects. And this is a classification and ranking of people who move from one place to another, such as immigrants, migrants, refugees, exiles, etc. In particular, I look at how the dissident dreamer, the undocuqueer, and the Oaxaca Californians complicate and expand the lexicon of mobility. Dreamer, dissident and otherwise, undocuqueer, and Oaxaca Californians are relatively new words. I will admit that I learned Oaxaca Californians from my own students. They're the ones who introduced it to me. To explore their meanings, I draw from queer theory and critical Latinx indigeneities as I read videos of the disruption of Obama's speech by members of Asian students promoting immigrant rights through education in San Francisco in November of 2013. I also analyzed digital illustrations by the self-professed undocuqueer artist Julio Salgado, and I discuss a series of murals by the Zapotec artist collective Tlacololocos at the Central Library in downtown LA over 2017-18. I open my book with Carlisle, and I close with the transnational indigenous space of Oaxaca, California, to show how indigenous migrants aren't an oxymoron, and how indigenous people have been and continue to be part of the processes of assimilation and immigration. Like the woman in the Zoot Suit, assimilation is a study of absence and its significance. My first book draws attention to the erasure of Mexican-American women in Chicano historiography. Similarly, my second book scrutinizes what and who's missing in conversations about assimilation and the implications of that absence. Assimilation matters because it's connected to ideas about who can participate, remain, and thrive in society. Whether they're native born or newcomers or citizens or non-citizens, people who aren't considered real or legitimate Americans don't enjoy the state's protections or resources. Instead, they're targets of state violence, including heightened surveillance and expulsion. By introducing the paradox of assimilation, I aim to enrich our understanding of assimilation. I want to dispel the widespread, pernicious, and enduring perception that assimilation is the exclusive domain of European immigrants, their white US citizen descendants, and the people who have the power and privilege to move across borders with the state's authorization. And I want to explain how it's possible and not right for a group, for example, undocumented farm workers during a pandemic, to be essential and excluded at the same time. In doing so, I hope to call attention to the commonalities and contradictions, the hope and hypocrisy, and the dreams and disparities that bind us. So thank you for your attention and giving me the opportunity to share my work with you.
So many teachers are doing that.
Exactly.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you for those remarks and thank you for the book. So I have some brief comments to get us started off on what I'm sure will be a very, very rich discussion. Oh, sure. Sure. So there is so much that I like about this book, and let me confess that, that as a scholar who writes in the assimilation tradition, I opened this book thinking that it was going to be a scathing critique of assimilation, and so I started off reading with some skepticism. I was sort of, just maybe disciplinary prejudices. I'm not sure what was motivating that, but what I found is that it's an incredibly brave account. And as you point out, folks who write in the immigration tradition, the assimilation tradition, have not been terribly brave when it comes to answering questions about how the perspective in all of its kind of various forms explains the experiences of Native Americans and Black folks in the United States. And in fact, most of us just punt. The racialization tradition essentially wholesale rejects assimilation altogether, in spite of what I would argue is tremendous evidence in favor of the theory.
We're speaking English with each other right now.
We're totally, and so like you, and I have never quite, in fact, I was just reviewing a paper that was positioning assimilation and racialization as these kind of opposing accounts, which I've never actually understood, but have never, that is, I've never understood the notion that these are opposing accounts. To me, they've always seemed like they're mutually reinforcing, that you can't understand assimilation without understanding racialization, and yet somehow, and I think it's partly just because they come from kind of different orientations, we as scholars have kind of pulled them apart, but you don't, you force them back together. I don't think you just force them back together, you actually uncover the fact that they've always been a part and parcel of a kind of common perspective. And so it's a tremendously brave account. It's intellectually sharp, and I love that part of it. I also loved the historical details, and there's some of which I was totally unaware of. So the fact that the Carlisle School was not just a school for assimilating Native Americans, forcefully assimilating Native Americans, but it also included African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and to some degree Mexicans, a history I didn't know about at all. The travels of Booker T. Washington and Robert Park, and I consider myself a sort of reader of Park, I didn't know anything about this, and the connections that they made, especially Washington, between the kind of assimilability of, to say that 5 times fast, the assimilability of Southern Eastern European immigrants and African Americans in the United States. And then the treatment of Japanese Americans and Dreamers as kind of mid-century contemporary denizens, I thought was absolutely brilliant. So I have some questions, and these are like really high-level questions. Some of them may dig into the detail, but just to get us started. So the way that I've always thought about assimilation is that it has 2 lives, that it has the life of a kind of prescriptive ideology of what should be. And I think that life of assimilation comes out particularly in the Carlisle School, also to some degree in the writings of Booker T. Washington. And so that life is very well on display here. And then I've also thought of assimilation as having a second life, and that's as a descriptive theory of that comes from social science. Folks like Park all the way up to, Alba and Portes and Minjo and others. And that descriptive theory is based on observations of patterns across generations. And there are ways in which the 2 intersect occasionally. I would say less so in the kind of post-65 era, more so in the kind of earlier periods. But you in the book kind of tack back and forth between the 2, kind of at times providing the account of the intellectual history, and then at times providing an account of the way that the idea was put into practice and all of the problems associated with that. So I guess I have 2 questions given, and so the first is, is it right to think of assimilation as having 2 lives, or is it much like the racialization and assimilation accounts, they're actually 1 life? And then I guess the second question, this is a really small question, if you were to put on your kind of prescriptive hat and you don't toss out assimilation, this is not an account of, this is not saying assimilation is a bunch of bunk, this is actually kind of embracing it and recasting it. But so there's a lot of implied critiques. What should assimilation look like? Like, what is a healthy assimilation to the extent that you think there is one? So maybe just the first question, just to restate it, is that the right way to characterize it? And maybe this is for my selfish learning, like, have I got it wrong all along? And then the second question is like, what does good assimilation look like? Healthy assimilation look like?
So I just want to start off by saying thank you for reading my book, and I am delighted that you read it, and I appreciate your very generous reception of it. It's really important for me that social scientists read this book because I am in dialogue with social scientists. I finished writing this book at CASBIS, which is a hub for social scientists. I teach in a social sciences division, like my appointment at UCC, Latin American and Latino Studies is housed in the social sciences division. So my most proximate colleagues are sociologists, economists, anthropologists, political scientists, and I've learned a lot from them. But what I also see as someone who comes out of the humanities and then who has worked in these interdisciplinary spaces for most of my career, and I have a PhD in ethnic studies, is that there's a lot of siloization, within the university. And what really struck me was how anthropologists are having their own conversations about assimilation that really run parallel to those of sociologists and political scientists. I was really struck, for example, by the similarities in the conclusions of Aristide Zolberg, who was a political scientist, anthropologists like Frederick Barth, and then Alba and Nee, and Portes and Rumbaut, Min Zhou, etc. I was like, wow, a lot of them are reaching the same conclusions, but they're not citing each other. And so this is why spaces like CASBIS and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity are so important, because they are meeting grounds. Regarding though the bashing of assimilation, I get a lot of that in ethnic studies in particular. Like, why do you want to talk about that? And I'm like, because assimilation is actually really important, and I personally find it very fascinating. This is why I wrote a book about it. But yeah, there's this dismissal, as you've correctly observed. And I'm like, people, we're talking to each other in English right now. I mean, this was my critique of Huntington, like, oh, these Hispanics aren't learning English. And it's like, dude, I am reading your fears and anxieties in English. I'm one of the 35.4 million Hispanics over whom you are fretting. And so, yeah, I mean, this is one of the manifestations, though, of assimilation. The fact that we are speaking English when, it's not my parents' first language. And I know it's not your father's first language, but here we are.
It's not my mom's first language.
Here we are speaking it together. But regarding your questions, I love this observation about the two lives of assimilation. I think that is very rich and generative. And I have not thought about assimilation in this way. And so I think that this is something worth thinking over further. Yes, assimilation it can be an imperative. And we see this in terms like Anglo-conformity. It's obvious. We see, okay, we're all supposed to conform to it's obvious. It can be prescriptive. I think that's the term you use. Normative. All right. But the descriptive theory, and I think this is where the contributions from social scientists are particularly valuable. Like you noted, observations of patterns across generations. That's something I don't do, as a cultural, literary critic and historian. Like I admire, for example, a longitudinal study, like what's the one by Thayes and Ortiz? Generations of Exclusion. That's an amazing. What's amazing about this book, Generations of Exclusion, if you're not familiar with it, these scholars at UCLA conducted a survey of Hispanics in LA and San Antonio in the 60s. And then there was this, all the documents were just stored away in the library. And then there was this massive renovation of the library at UCLA, and the boxes were rediscovered. And so these scholars in the 90s decided to go out and hunt down the participants who had participated in this study, a generation and their children. And so they were able to collect, I mean, just the insight into not only these people's lives, but just society in LA and San Antonio, just the kind of both telescoping and microscoping that this longitudinal study provided. Very impressive. And again, this is where the social scientists come in. And social scientists are very good at looking for patterns.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I can't tell if I have kind of treated assimilation as having these two lives for my own, just to make it neat in my head intellectually, because it's a way of kind of disowning the baggage of assimilation, which is the kind of prescriptive part, and owning the descriptive part. And I think part of the story that you tell, especially the early history of assimilation, is that, at least this is one of the best connections, it's not that easy to disentangle them, especially when some of the key protagonists are kind of moving through this space and informing each other, right? So, the Booker T. Washington, Robert Park thing especially. But I think the contemporary period, as there's been a kind of resuscitation of the notion, Cortez and Minjot and Ruben Rambau and Alvin Me and me, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
That I don't know, I have to think more about whether this is just a trick I play on myself.
No, I think it's definitely, I think it's worth considering. I think the one thing to keep in mind, though, if we're going to look at the two lives of assimilation, is to always keep in mind that assimilation is a relationship of power.
Yeah.
And so, like, what power relations are at work when it's prescriptive, and what power relations are at work when it's a descriptive theory?
Yeah.
I think that's an important question to keep in mind. But I think that this kind of dual perspective enriches our understandings of assimilation.
For sure.
And then what should a healthy assimilation look like? That's a great question. So a lot of people have expressed discomfort with the word assimilation, and they want to replace it with integration. And okay, so because maybe I come out of English and literary study, I'm like, but integration is not a neutral term either, people. I mean, like, let's talk about like undocumented labor, for example. Undocumented workers are extremely well integrated in the economy, especially in construction and agriculture. However, they are excluded by the state. In fact, they are persecuted and expelled. They're targeted by the state. And that exclusion and persecution by the state is what enables, in many ways, that their integration in the labor market is often predicated on that very that's integration too. And so I don't think, integration is a superior term. I think we need to scrutinize all of these terms and look at their many meanings and contradictions. But a healthy assimilation would be, I think, a more equitable society, a society in which there is more, more equal, or just more access to resources, healthcare, clean water, education, clean air. These are the essentials. And I think that if people have access to these things, the essentials, security, then we can start looking at, okay, well, what about access to other institutions like voting, political participation, etc. Then that, I think that is a healthier form of assimilation. If we're looking at basically a more just, equitable distribution of resources and wealth in a society.
Yeah, and I think so. Especially when I talk to non-academic audiences, and they kind of fret about assimilation, I usually tell them two things. One is that, and I think this resonates with some of what you just said, I usually tell them, one, we often have this notion, especially for people whose ancestors came during the big European migration to the United States, that they got off the boat at Ellis Island, and then on the way to Battery Park, they learned how to speak English perfectly. They were pledging allegiance to the flag and waving it everywhere they went. And it's a multi-generational process. And then the other thing, and this kind of is inspired by me, and I think resonates with what you just said, Albanese say that assimilation is what happens when people are making other plans. So people are pursuing their economic aspirations. They're trying to live in a neighborhood with more resources, a neighborhood that is safer. They're trying to advance themselves economically by going to, by getting education and not thrust them into environments like this one at Stanford, although Stanford's not the greatest example, but like or college and universities anywhere where they're interacting with people, lots of different backgrounds. And it's through that interaction that the boundaries start to break down, right? This is sort of the contact there. And then you get mass intermarriage. And this is really the kind of key indicator of assimilation, which maybe kind of leads to my second question, if I might say. So I actually agree with you that it's about the kinds of things that we think of when we think of traditional justice that brings about a kind of healthy assimilation where people have equal participation, and in equal participation find themselves interacting and seeing some of themselves in each other. And there's this kind of amalgam. And that's, I think that's something the country is longing for right now. I don't actually think, immigration becomes a focal point. I think the biggest divisions are political. That's actually scary. Our disintegration is defined so heavily by politics, but that's another story for another time. So I want to get to questions from the audience, and then also folks online. Can I ask one more? Is it, or is it going on too long?
Yeah, one more thing.
So let me also just say, like, the true test of whether I like a book is called the Nova test. My wife's name, her name is Nova. My wife's name is Nova. And if I'm reading a book at home, some of you know Nova, if I'm reading a book at home and I stop and I'm like, yeah, this book is really good, and I'll say it, I'll also tell if a book's bad. So you can, the Nova test, this totally passed. I was sitting there the last few nights and I'm like, it's actually a really good book. She has no idea what I'm talking about. She just kind of walked like, whatever. But anyway, so this flies over the Nova test. So I guess this comes from my perspective as a sociologist. And in a book, you can't do everything. In a career with a research, you can't do anything. And so, you have selectively, and I think wisely, and chosen certain kinds of evidence, historical evidence, novels, some contemporary case studies of populations and individuals that I think illuminate the concepts really well. And I think that some of the survey data complicates the picture a little bit. So the notion that the dreamers, for example, are the kind of contemporary denizens, those regarded as sort of in some ways kind of a model minority in their own right. If I look at public opinion, this is one of the kind of things that I preach to public audiences too. The public opinion about the dreamers is incredibly positive, right? It's also true of undocumented immigrants in general. This goes back 15 years. Large majorities of Americans think that there should be a legalization program, a broad legalization program, and this speaks to your work, provided that they learn English, pay back taxes, and pass a background check. So there's some barriers for entry. Intermarriage rates, especially among the biggest immigrant groups, are off the charts, especially given the size. So, taking Asians broadly, Latinos broadly, the intermarriage rates are incredibly high. And among the children of those, not necessarily intermarriages, but children who have mixed ancestry, their outcomes, and this is Richard Alba's new stuff, their outcomes actually look a lot like white people's. And in fact, children with one Asian parent, one white parent have the best socioeconomic outcomes of anyone. They do better than whites. So, at least socioeconomically, they're like whiter than white people, just in that sense, but not identity is another question. And then if you kind of step back and think, what do Americans think about assimilation? What's their conception? What do they think? So how would they answer that question? Like, what is a healthy assimilation? I turn to my colleague and collaborator, Debbie Schildkraut's work. She did a nationally representative survey. And one of the questions she asked was, what do you think should be entailed in making a good American? Or a true American, excuse me, true. What do you think should be entailed in making a true American? 75% of her respondents said blending into the larger society. A similar percentage of respondents also said maintaining the traditions of ethnic traditions of your ancestors. And so to me, that speaks to a desire to find something in common while also maintaining a sense of uniqueness, a sense of distinctiveness that's rooted in ethnicity. So I think people want some of that connection, but they don't want it to be all defining. And when I say people, I'm talking about this nationally represented established differences, to be sure. So no, I offer this up, and I guess I asked, and this is hard to get you to, this is unfair to ask you to think on the spot about this, but is there a place for this in an account of assimilation that includes racialization, that includes the reification of boundaries, the blurring, the crossing of boundaries, and I'm paraphrasing your definition.
Yes, I think there is, and I think we have historical antecedents. So for example, just in terms of like theories and definitions of assimilation, we have, the classical model of assimilation, known simply as the assimilation model, and that's often contrasted with the pluralist model. There are just two, I think these definitions and models really have very different assumptions about society, the mainstream, the host society, whatever we want to call it. And in the assimilation model, there's this assumption that there's this like core that everyone is supposed to be assimilating into. In the pluralist model, there's this assumption that there are many groups. Now, those groups historically, though, have been seen as ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Portuguese Americans, etc., German Americans. And I think, though, that that second model, the pluralist one, it does offer, I think, a kind of window into a possibility. I mean, the fact is that we do have this very real construct, race, and we live with it. And it has helped determine, like, who is and is not in this very space here with us now. And so there's no overlooking it, or denying it. I think we need to incorporate it into theories, ideas about assimilation. Now, the idea of blending in. So that fascinates me too, because it's like, and this is where your work comes in, the other side of assimilation, like blending into what? Into who, like who's the referent now?
Yeah.
If there's been so much transformation, like at the macro level. And also blending in, I mean, there are some people who talk about assimilation. I mean, look at how widespread precarity is now.
Yeah.
Like, do we really want to just reproduce more of, is that what blending in means? To, basically enter the precariat and, not have access to regular healthcare and basically cobble together gigs just to make ends meet. And I mean, like, is that what people want to assimilate into? So I would like basically continue to question, well, what is the referent here? What is the mainstream, the core? Like, what are we blending into?
I think that's a great way to segue into questions from the audience. And as a reminder, we have a live audience and we have an audience joining us on Zoom. And we'll take questions from both. But let's start with our live audience first. And maybe as I call on you, you can just say who you are and your affiliation. So Jose David.
I'm Jose David Saldivar. I'm professor of comparative literature at Stanford.
And one of my former advisors from Berkeley.
Berkeley. One thing that struck me, just how weird it is to hear, your first book is on Zoot Suits and women and Chicanas in Los Angeles. Very ethnic studies, very Chicano studies, Chicanx studies, and then the book on assimilation. I wonder if you could have written that book at Berkeley.
No, I could not have written it. No, but this is very much a comparative ethnic studies project. I mean, because again, going back to what I learned from sociologists, assimilation is relational.
Right.
And so it's like you got to look
I
at.
was struck by it, and you made a great job. Your transitioning about your work really made a lot of sense. About the
the absent, and that's a lot of Judith Butler's influence too. Judith Butler was another one of mine.
So I have a second question. I mean, it's, is your work the story you're saying about the diaspora? Is it about border crossing? It seems very American centric because you're focusing on assimilation in the United States.
It is very U.S. centric.
And so I'm just wondering, what are other theories of this process around the world. And I'm thinking,
They vary.
I might even taught it to you in a grad seminar by Fernando Ortiz, the Cuban
Yes.
anthropologist,
Yes.
who's responding to Parks and to the 1940 school by quibbling with the term assimilation. And he said it's a little bit more complex in Latin America, the Caribbean, given the history of colonization. And he comes up with the term transculturation. It's a process of genocide initially in Cuba of indigenous peoples, then the mixing of, uses the metaphors of tobacco and sugar to incorporate each other, and they have it's a marriage made in hell for each.
Yes,
So
and
we
then
have transculturation. So I'm just saying, how does that fit into your story?
so there are many different ways for talking about difference and the incorporation or elimination of difference in diverse, what we might call multicultural, heterogeneous societies. And yes, we have transculturation and mestizaje, coming out of Latin America. These terms have been problematized, it's not like mestizaje was just like, happy, marriage of like the Indians and the Spaniards and Africans are always dropped out of that, model. In France, for example, there's this notion of republicanism. And you are French, you're supposed to be French above anything else, in particular above Muslim. And then, of course, I think the UK has a lot of, it's probably the most similar, to the US in many ways, and not just because of English, but even I'm always surprised, like I had to ask a colleague, like, okay, so I'm BIPOC now. This is a new term, okay? And you all are BAME? How do you all say it? British?
BAME.
How is it pronounced?
BAME.
He didn't know. He was like, I don't even know. Black, African, Middle Eastern, I think.
I don't think so. It's Asian. The A is
Oh,
Asian.
Black, Asian. You're right. Because I asked this colleague who is of
Minority ethnic. It's Black, Asian,
minority ethnic. Thank you. He didn't even know what it was, and I'm like, all these terms. I mean, so I just found it very interesting that BIPOC and BAME seem to emerge around the same time. Where was I going with? But yeah, so there are many models, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. When I first envisioned this project, I wanted to compare the US and France, but my French is not good enough, and it will never be good enough to do like the kind of archival work that I did, for this book in English. But I was really struck by, so this group I'm in with these scholars, migration scholars in Europe, and then the Americans are extremely diverse. In fact, I would say out of all of us, there's only like one white person. Everyone else is Latinx, Asian, and the Europeans are all white, except for this one colleague who's of South Asian descent. And I asked one of the leaders of this group that I'm in, Translations of Migration, like, where are the people of color? Where are the Bames? Because I was like, surely aren't they in the university too? Like, where are they? Why aren't they a part of this conversation? Like, I feel that I have a lot of affinities with the mayor of London. I can't remember his name right now. Yeah, and also like Zinedine, the soccer player Zidane. Not that I'm a famous soccer player or a mayor of a major city, but like these are also the children of like immigrants who, like, I feel that like I have, as a Chicana, I have real commonalities with these people. But yeah, I don't know, maybe someday. I'll get even more comparative. I honestly don't have that ability, that skill right now.
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Gross. I'm associate professor in the Graduate School of Education. Thank you so much for this talk. I have to sort of own that I I am one of these, I'm a linguistic anthropologist who has hated on a lot of literature around assimilation for some time. It's interesting that you invoke English as a sign of assimilation, because I think for many of us, we look at the ways that it's never enough English for millions and millions of kids who seem to have assimilated and yet are still relegated to remedial education, despite, adhering to some norm or it being incorporated into some norm. And it's that slipperiness of assimilation that I keep thinking about and that your presentation was making me think about, especially in relation to the example of, say, Kamala Harris and Barack Obama. On the one hand, on an identitarian level, being perceived as un-American or not embodying ideal Americanness, and yet very quickly on a structural level coming to inhabit American imperial white supremacist, machinations on so many scales, so that within her first few months in the vice presidency, Kamala Harris goes to Central America and says, don't come. Barack Obama, think about what migration, what deportation and detention looked like, and think about what drone imperial warfare looked like. And so I'm trying to think about that slipperiness of how someone on one level can embody something that is perceived as not assimilated, and yet on another level can enact and further the ideals, the most nefarious ideals of that model of what assimilation is. And so what do you do with that kind of slipperiness?
That is I think that's a great observation. I think we reckon with it, first of all, as you're doing, just acknowledge it. I mean, Obama and Harris, like that, this is their job. I mean, I hate to say it, like, this is what the president and the vice president do. They defend the status quo. And so, I mean, the other example would be Colin Powell, who again upheld this, another kind of like, this is another example of like the American dream, the veracity of the American dream. And in many ways, his story is touching. He went to community college, and people, he never forgot his roots. At the same time, I mean, all of us, I mean, I myself am the product, my father was in the military. I mean, my father built freeways too. He worked for Caltrans for 38 years. He actually literally built the Long Beach Freeway, the 710 freeway, and the 5 going through Anaheim, through Orange County. And on indigenous land, on Tongva land. And I think all of us are complete. And this is why I say this settler colony come nation of immigrants. All of us are complicit. Even the Zapotec immigrants, who are arriving in LA today.
I mean, one other way to think about this too, if you don't mind me chiming in, is to think about historic immigrant groups that have embraced the kind of notion of insider and had to turn around and decide and often had a very ambivalent response to those who came from the same origin broadly conceived after them, right? So, the first big wave of German Jews, and then you get a wave of Russian Jews. The German Jews have had some foothold in American society, had to decide whether the later arriving, mostly Russian Jews, were having like not a corrupting influence, but giving them a bad name. And do we reach out, or do we lend a hand, or do we lend a kind of a closed hand? Mexicans, the long history of Mexican immigration, each new wave of immigration was also met by a wave of previous immigrants who had to decide, descendants of immigrants who had to decide ambivalently whether they were insiders or outsiders, the group that came after, right? And this continues to go on. So, I mean, I don't think it's helpful actually to parse it as like either or. I think, I don't know. I think it's part of the kind of ambivalent story of immigration of the United States and how, whoever the we is, treat the newcomers. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
No, I think it's great.
Yeah, please introduce yourself and tell us your affiliation.
Student in graduate school of education, studying Afro-diasporic religious communities and I study graduate religious community. And so I'm also Puerto Rican, and so I'm fascinated to see this work around Puerto Ricans in Carlisle School. And so like my reading about the relationship with Puerto Rico in this country has been Puerto Ricans have always been seen from the beginning of the invasion. So now it's unassimilable, right? Puerto Ricans were, I mean, I would say stateless for a period of time, right? Citizens of Puerto Rico, right? Until 1917, I believe, and then became citizens of the United States, right? And then I also see this tension between the Puerto Rican sectors of the Puerto Rican bourgeoisie that wants to gain citizenship and by claiming Puerto Ricans are white. So for example, doing genealogy work of my own family and seeing them understood by the Spanish Empire as being Black and mulatto and mestizo, and then that transition to all of them being considered white by the 1910, 1920 census, right? And so I'm just fascinated, what was the vision of folks who, in the Carlisle schools, who experiment in assimilating Puerto Ricans when the relationship has been one of which these people are completely unassimilable in terms of our state policies and our relationship, and in the diaspora as well.
So it was really fascinating to look at the records of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The school kept a lot of detailed, it is impartial, you know, I mean, it is, excuse me, what do I want to say? It's incomplete. There are holes. It's not like, oh, this is, you know, comprehensive, but there are a lot of documents at the National Archives and then at the Cumberland County Historical Society in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, which is where Carlisle is. And a lot of, so these are all the handwritten document, well, some, and then you see the transition to the typewriter at a certain point. The students were required to complete these intake forms, and they were required to identify their tribe. And many of these forms have X's, they put an X over the word tribe, the student and or the student's guardian, and said, I am not an Indian. I am tribe Spanish, tribe, and I was like, they're doing it back in the day. We still do it today. You know what I mean? It's just like, because this is the power, the lure of whiteness, and the demand is not just like, it's not just alluring, it's a demand, it's an imperative. And then in the correspondence between the school officials and like prospective employers, like I read in one letter from the school superintendent to the director of Indian Affairs in Denver. Okay, this student is a very good Mason and he works well, he's polite, but you should know that he is a common mulatto. Like it's written there in the letter, you know, like just know this if you consider hiring him and when you meet him, like if you do hire him. And this student was not hired in Denver. And so this is my point when I say they were being absorbed into a racial hierarchy. Now, many of these students did come from, the Puerto Rican students did come from elite families because this was the strategy of Richard Henry Pratt. When he went to a tribe, he took the chief's children because this was a way of basically showing the other members of the community that you want this too for your children. This was a strategy used by Indian boarding schools. So he did the same thing in Puerto Rico, and they took the children of the elite for the most part, but not all of them were. So there was one student who went on to become a very prominent educator in Puerto Rico. Osuna is his last name. He was not, you know, his job in Puerto Rico, he could read. He read the news. He was the newspaper reader in the tobacco factory. Like, so he was able to read. So he read the paper while the workers worked. And he and his family saw this as an opportunity. Like, you're going to go to a boarding school in the United States of America. And he aspired, I think, to become a lawyer or a judge. And he thought, oh, this is my path. And he was shocked. It's a very Fanon moment when he was like, who are these Indians I'm surrounded by here? They were shocked. The students wrote things like in their letters, like, I only knew about Indians as like savages. like from the stories I'd heard. Like I just like held my head all night. The first night I was put into my dorm room because I was afraid my roommate was going to scalp me. Like these are in their letters, which are in the National Archives. And so, yeah, so this is the power, I think, of archival work, which, you know, needs to be put in dialogue with the surveys and the longitudinal study. I mean, this is why we need these interdisciplinary spaces and conversations.
So I have a question from one of our Zoom attendees. Marco Flores is a graduate fellow and a graduate student in art and art history. Marco asks if you can elaborate a bit on what you see as the role of visual arts as a way of countering assimilation. You mentioned undocumented artist Hugo Salgado, and so Marco's curious what role the arts have in social movements such as the queer undocumented movements.
Okay, great question. I'm always drawn to the visual. You know, my first book, The Woman in the Zoot Suit, is, you know, it's a study of the sartorial and its significance. I was really drawn to the murals by Flaco de Locos. I never expected that photo to end up on my book. I'm delighted it did. Because all of a sudden I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting way to picture assimilation, to represent it visually at least. Salgado is in many ways, he is he's probably the most prominent artist, you know, of the movement, you know, around like undocumented youth, you know, movements plural. I hate to use the singular, but he's produced a lot of the art, like advocating for the DREAM Act, for example. At the same time, you know, he produced a lot of these images of like the young undocumented dreamer in the cap and gown. And then he turned around though and became very critical of that very image of the dreamer, you know, as the model minority, as the valedictorian, and so on. I think though, just to answer the question directly, I mean, the visual arts are an integral part of these movements. I mean, look around this room. We see, what's her name from? Yes, from Oakland. Yes, exactly. They are, I mean, for me, they are not ancillary. You know, they are articulations. You know, they are producers of meaning, not like just reflections. And so, yeah, I mean, Salgado is making, I think, important interventions, you know, in the conversation on the future of the undocumented in this country.
That's all I've got from Zoom.
So maybe one last question. Roberto, you want to take last question? Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate the conversation, especially as a queer Chicano from LA. I really appreciate the last chapter, and I appreciated the conversation around possibilities of potentiality and grounding it in Muniz's work. And so I wonder if you can kind of elaborate using the dreamers, which rightfully has critiques that you just mentioned, the undocumented queer movement that really kind of tried to complicate a lot of the dreamer kind of discourse. And then you have Oaxaca, California, which is has an identity. And we also have Puebla, York, which is also another indigenous kind of group that has a lot of connection, is doing a lot to kind of things. So I want to, when this open, like, why do you think we should be looking to spaces? What can these spaces really tell us as this place of potentiality of where we are going?
So these spaces places, so going back to Oaxaca, California. So my students introduced me to this term, this portmanteau, and I just trip out on the portmanteaus, you know, like, whoa, there are more. Blaxican, undocuqueer, Mexipino, Oaxaca, California. And I do an exercise. I teach a class at UC Santa Cruz. It's the kind of intro to Latin American and Latino studies. And, you know, one of the things I do to show my students that these are fields, like with histories and these enduring conversations, and that we are a part of these conversations. And so what I have them do is I have them look at a couple of like anthologies, you know, like glossaries, basically, like keywords in Latino studies. And then there's another one, key and critical terms in Latin American and Caribbean studies. And Latin American and Latino studies is the union of, you know, area Latin American studies and ethnic Latinx studies. And I tell them, I want you all to write a new, pick a word that it does not appear in either of these compendia and write a definition. So what is missing? And the keywords in Latino studies, you know, edited by Nancy Mirabal, Deb Vargas, and Larry LaFontaine Stokes. That came out in 2017. So it is aging, but it's better than its predecessor, which I'm not even going to name because that wasn't a very good book. Like there's no dreamer, there's no entry on dreamer in it. And so I've had students write about that. And then I had students write about Oaxaca, California. And I was like, oh, what does this term mean? And like, you know, well, I'm Oaxaca, California, you know what I mean? They write their definition and they'd have to go and find some academic sources, you know, citations and so on. That's a part of the exercise. And that is where the potentiality comes in. Because, you know, these are dynamic fields and society we know is dynamic. And this is where my students come in too, like, and how I learn from them. And so, yeah, I feel that the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet, but you got to end your book somewhere.
That's a great place to end. Please join me in thanking Professor Ramírez.
Thank you for all the work.
There's food, right? Will you sign my book?
Oh, you're so sweet. I didn't bring my white pen.
That's okay. I marked it up. As you can see, I was close reading.
And also, join me in thanking also Tomás Jiménez.
Oh, yeah.